It started with a question. A simple one. But when it was asked, the entire room fell silent. The view had been heated that day. Louder than usual. More restless. Voices clashing. Egos flaring. And underneath it all, a sense that something was about to break. Jonathan Roumie had been invited as a guest. Not because the panel respected his work, but because they underestimated him. He walked onto the stage with quiet confidence. Not the kind that demands attention. The kind that makes you lean in. The applause was polite. Hesitant. He took his seat at the end of the table. Beside him sat Whoopi Goldberg. Poised. Skeptical. Arms crossed. They introduced him. Star of The Chosen. A man who played Jesus for millions around the world. He smiled. Gracious, calm. And then, it happened. Whoopi leaned forward. "Let me ask you something, Jonathan," she said. The studio quieted. "You say you played Jesus on television. But I've watched you. I've read interviews. And honestly, sometimes I think you don't even understand him." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan didn't move. Whoopi pressed on. "You say Jesus was about love. But what does that even mean anymore? Because I hear people like you talk about faith. But I see people like you stay silent when it really matters." There was no laughter, no applause, just silence. And eyes on him. Jonathan took a breath. Not a quick one. A deep, slow inhale. Like a man about to walk into a storm. He looked at Whoopi. Not with anger. Not with fear. But with heartbreak. Not for himself. For her. And that was the moment. The moment that changed everything. But it wasn't just what he was about to say. It was what led up to it. The story behind the stillness. The pain behind the peace. Because no one knew what Jonathan Roumie had faced in the weeks leading up to that show. No one knew what he'd lost or what he'd decided the night before. He sat in that chair. The public thought they were seeing an actor. What they were about to witness was something far more real. 2 weeks earlier, Jonathan was alone in his apartment in LA. Phone off. Curtains drawn. Heart shattered. He had just come back from visiting his hometown in New York, after burying his mentor, Father Mateo. A man who had once told him, "Don't ever play Jesus unless you're willing to be wounded for it." He hadn't understood what that meant. Not then, but now, he did. Hollywood had started turning on him. Articles were circling, quietly mocking his faith. Even people on set began whispering things they wouldn't say to his face. Too Catholic, too serious, too Jesus, and worse. Some Christian circles had begun attacking him too. For not being loud enough. For not calling out sin. For portraying Jesus with too much compassion. He was being crucified on both sides. And yet he said nothing. He prayed. He sat in that apartment with a rosary in hand, tears streaming, asking one question over and over. "Jesus, what do you want me to say?" No answer. Not a sound. Just silence. But in that silence, a kind of peace. Not comfort. Peace. He wasn't supposed to defend himself. He was supposed to reflect. Him, even if it meant being misunderstood. Especially if it meant being misunderstood. And so, when the producers from The View called, he hesitated. He knew what they were hoping for. Drama. Division. Headlines. He almost declined. But someone nudged him forward. He said yes, and now, he was here, staring across a table at a woman whose eyes were daring him to flinch. And he didn't. He opened his mouth, but not to answer. Not yet. He smiled a sad smile. Not for the cameras. For her. Then he said, "I don't think Jesus needs me to defend him. But I do think he wants me to show him." The words hung in the air. Whoopi blinked. Joy Behar shifted in her chair. The audience leaned forward. Then Whoopi laughed. Not cruelly. Just confused. "Show him. What does that even mean?" she said. And just like that, the conversation began. But beneath every word was a battle. Because Jonathan wasn't just talking to Whoopi. He was talking to the world. And the world was listening. Jonathan leaned forward, still calm, still grounded. "The thing is," he said slowly, "Jesus wasn't always loud. He didn't shout people into believing him. He sat with them. Listened. He loved them even when they misunderstood him." The panel shifted uncomfortably. Sonny Hostin jumped in. "But Jonathan, don't you think there's a danger in being too passive? Too quiet about injustice?" Jonathan nodded. "I do. And Jesus was never passive. But he didn't start with condemnation. He started with relationship." Whoopi smirked. "But we don't have time for relationships on national TV. We've got people getting hurt. We've got policies ruining lives. People like you talk about love, but stay out of the fight." Jonathan looked down for a moment, then back up. eyes glistening. I am in the fight, he said, voice tight. Every time I walk on a set, I fight. Every time I speak about Jesus, I'm told to tone it down, to be more palatable. I lose roles, I lose friends. I've lost respect in the industry. But I keep going because I believe someone watching still needs hope. A ripple moved through the crowd. Whoopi's face changed only slightly, and the cameras kept rolling. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, trying not to let the weight of the moment crush him. Every word he said was being scrutinized. Every gesture dissected. Joy Behar leaned in next. So, let me get this straight. You play the most radical figure in human history. A man who flipped tables, defied empires, and you're telling me he'd just smile at injustice today? Jonathan shook his head gently. No, not smile. But he wouldn't destroy people either. He came to heal them, even the ones doing the hurting. There it was again. Not a mic drop, but something deeper. An invitation, and it was beginning to get under their skin. Backstage, producers started whispering. A few looked nervous. They'd expected a mess, an argument, a blow-up. Instead, this conviction, grace, truth, and something else they hadn't prepared for. Authenticity. Back on stage, Whoopi straightened in her chair. I think, she said, slowly, a lot of us are tired of Christians picking and choosing what parts of Jesus to talk about. You all talk about love but stay silent when people are marginalized. You talk about grace but ignore suffering. Where was Jesus when George Floyd died? When kids are locked in cages? When women are denied basic rights? Her voice cracked, just a little. And that was the moment. Jonathan didn't rush to respond. He didn't counter. He saw her pain, and for a few seconds, he just looked at her. Then he said he was there. Silence. Jesus was there, suffering with them, bleeding with them, crying over them, and he's still there now. But not everyone who says his name speaks for him. A gasp from the audience. Jonathan's tone didn't change, still soft, still unwavering. I'm sorry, he said gently. I'm sorry for every time someone used his name to hurt instead of heal. That's not him. That's us, failing him. Whoopi's eyes dropped. For the first time, she looked unsure. Jonathan turned to the crowd quietly. I didn't come here to argue. I came here because I believe Jesus isn't just a name. He's a presence. And if I can leave just one person with the feeling that he sees them, really sees them, then this moment matters. The room was still. No shouting, no laughing. Just silence. Holy silence. Jonathan swallowed hard. He could feel the tremble in his hands, but something inside him had broken free, and it wasn't rage, it was clarity. Whoopi finally looked up. I don't agree with everything you're saying, she said, voice softer now, but I believe you. Believe it. Jonathan nodded. That's all I ask. The dialogue paused, but the tension hadn't disappeared. It had shifted, gone deeper, because it wasn't just about Jesus anymore. It was about what people saw when they heard his name. And Jonathan knew that name had been hijacked, weaponized, politicized. He wasn't here to reclaim it with power. He was here to embody it with love. And that love was making people uncomfortable. The next segment started. A light joke, a new guest, some music. But the atmosphere had changed. And behind the scenes, things were boiling. A senior producer stormed into the control room. What the hell was that? She barked. He was supposed to crack, or fight back, not preach. But it was too late. Clips were already going viral. Tweets like, did Jonathan Roumie just silence the view with a whisper? That was the most sincere expression of faith I've seen on live TV. I don't even believe in God, but something about that man made me want to. And the comments kept flooding in. Jonathan didn't know any of it yet, because as the next commercial break hit, he was still sitting in that chair, quiet, composed, but his heart was pounding. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because what was coming next would change everything. When the cameras cut to commercial, the studio was thick with tension. Producers moved quickly. Assistants whispered into earpieces. There was a quiet panic, like something sacred had slipped into a space designed for spectacle, and no one quite knew what to do with it. Jonathan remained still. He could feel the battle wasn't over, just paused. And he was right, because when they came back from break, Whoopi wasn't smiling. Not anymore. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice lower, now but sharper. Jonathan, I've got to ask you this directly. If Jesus really loved everyone like you say, then why do so many of his followers act like they hate half the country? The audience stirred. It was the question everyone had been circling. Jonathan looked at her, long and hard. And then, he didn't answer right away. He turned to the crowd, to the camera, then back to Whoopi. I wrestle with that too, he said honestly. Every day, a pause. I see the anger, the judgment, the self-righteousness, and it breaks my heart. Because I know that's not what Jesus stood for. That's not who he is. Then why don't you speak out more? She pressed. You've got a platform. Use it. I do, Jonathan replied. But not with outrage. Not with hashtags. I speak out by living it. On set, in interviews. In rooms, no one sees when they ask me to compromise and I don't. When I lose jobs because I won't water down the gospel. That is my fight. Joy, Behar scoffed. But don't you think that's a little convenient? Staying quiet under the banner of humility, isn't that just a way to avoid controversy? Jonathan shook his head. I don't avoid controversy. I just won't manufacture it. He turned, locking eyes with Joy. You know what's more controversial than screaming at people? He asked. Loving them when they don't deserve it. Silence. You want to talk about radical? He added, voice growing steady. Jesus prayed for the people nailing him to a cross. He didn't cancel them. He forgave them. That's the kind of radical I follow. You could hear a pin drop. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. So are you saying we should just forgive everyone and move on? No accountability. Jonathan looked down at the floor, then back up. I'm saying forgiveness is accountability. It's not cheap grace. It costs something. It cost Jesus everything, and it still does. The audience began to shift. No cheers. No claps. Just awareness. Conviction. And something else. Curiosity. Sonny leaned in again. Voice softer now. Do you really believe one person can still make a difference in a world this broken? Jonathan smiled genuinely this time. I don't just believe it. I see it. Every day. Not in headlines. Not on big stages. But in quiet acts of mercy. In people who choose grace instead of vengeance. In those who still believe love is stronger than hate. And then, he paused, eyes glassy. My father died last year, he said suddenly. And as he was passing, he whispered something I'll never forget. The host stilled. He said, son, don't ever stop loving people. Even when they try to break you, that's when they need it most. A hush fell over the studio. Because this wasn't PR. It wasn't spin. It was raw. And it cut deep. Joy shifted in her seat. Whoopi blinked hard, looking away. And somewhere backstage, a sound guy whispered into his mic, man, this is different. But the moment hadn't reached its peak yet. That was still coming. Because just as the panel began to ease up, just as the emotional fog softened the room, a producer rushed in behind the scenes and handed Whoopi a phone. She looked down, eyes narrowing. What's this? She asked off-mic. The producer whispered, it's trending. Twitter's blowing up. He's being called Jesus Boy. Propaganda. Preacher. Whoopi looked up, and something changed in her face. Her defenses came back. The armor reassembled because in that moment, the world had re-entered the room. And it demanded drama. She cleared her throat. Jonathan, she said slowly, some people are calling you dangerous. Jonathan's brow furrowed. Dangerous? Yes, she said. For platforming outdated beliefs. For inspiring young people to follow something some would call oppressive. That was it. The moment, the real confrontation. Jonathan sat forward, face calm, but fire behind his eyes. I'm dangerous because I believe in grace, he asked. Because I think people deserve second chances. Because I believe the broken can still be made whole. No, Whoopi said. Because some people take what you say and twist it into something hateful. Jonathan nodded slowly. I can't control how people twist my words, but I can control how I say them. And I say this clearly. If anyone uses Jesus to justify hate, missed him completely. He turned to the camera again, voice resolute. If your Jesus makes you cruel, then you're not following Jesus, you're following yourself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One woman clapped, then another, and then silence returned. Heavy holy. Whoopi stared at him, expression unreadable. And Jonathan just looked back. No anger, no fear, just compassion and conviction. It was the climax. No one expected a man accused of hate, refusing to give it in return. Instead, offering truth, with love, and the world watching. The lights still burned hot overhead, but the studio had cooled, not in temperature but in tone. Something had shifted. Whoopi sat frozen in thought. her expression no longer one of challenge but of searching. There was something in Jonathan's words that unsettled her, but not in the way she'd expected. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't defended with pride. He'd simply spoken, with something rare in today's world, clarity and love. And now, even the audience wasn't sure what to do. Jonathan leaned forward again, his voice quieter, now almost like a prayer. "You know, I didn't come here to argue or convert anyone. I came here because I was asked about my faith, and I answered honestly, that's all." He turned to Whoopi gently. "I know people have been hurt by religion. I get it. And if I could sit down with every one of them and say, 'I'm sorry,' I would, because that pain is real." A pause. But pain isn't the end of the story. Jesus didn't die to build a religion that shames people. He died to set people free. And that freedom still matters. The camera zoomed in slowly, on his eyes, unflinching, kind. "I've seen addicts healed. I've seen marriages restored. I've seen people who wanted to take their own lives find hope again, not through politics or applause but because someone reminded them they mattered to God." A soft sniffle came from the front row. Someone wiped a tear, and then Whoopi finally spoke. But not with the energy she had earlier. This time, her voice cracked. "I was raised Catholic," she said quietly. Jonathan listened. "I used to believe. But the older I got, the more I saw people weaponize it, turned it into a club, use it against people like me." Jonathan nodded. "I understand." She stared at him. "You really believe Jesus would love someone like me?" He smiled, with his whole heart. A long silence. And then Whoopi looked away. Tears glistened, but didn't fall. Behind the cameras, even the crew grew still. Joy didn't crack another joke. Sunny stayed silent, because this wasn't entertainment anymore, it was real. The final moments of the show came quickly. The producers, unsure how to wrap it, simply let Jonathan speak one last time. So he did. He stood and faced the audience. "This world is loud, angry, divided. We're quick to label, quick to mock, slow to listen." He looked out, his voice full of emotion. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that God's voice still whispers through the noise. And sometimes, it shows up on a couch like this." He smiled. "I'm not perfect. I mess up a lot. But I know this. Jesus isn't finished with me, or with you, or with any of us." He placed his hand on his heart. "There's still time, still hope, still grace." And with that, he bowed his head briefly. A moment of stillness. Then the screen cut to black. The logo for The View faded in, but the echo of what had just happened wouldn't fade so quickly, because something rare had happened on live TV. Truth was spoken, not shouted. Faith was revealed, not forced. And a man the world tried to dismiss stood firm in love. Aftermath, off camera. That night, Twitter exploded. Clips of the moment were everywhere. #Jonathan Roumie trended globally. Some called him brave. Others called him delusional. But most just paused and listened again. Even people who didn't agree couldn't deny. Something real had been said. Whoopi didn't issue a statement, but she followed Jonathan on Instagram. 2 days later, Joy joked about it later in the week. "But even," she admitted, "it's been a long time since I felt something like that on this show." And Jonathan, he went back to filming The Chosen. But his inbox was flooded. Messages from atheists, Muslims, Christians, former believers, all saying the same thing. "I'm not sure what I believe, but thank you for being real." And late one night, a message came in that made Jonathan stop and stare. It was short. Anonymous. Just 5 words. "He really does love me." Jonathan read it 3 times, and then he smiled, whispered a prayer, and turned out the light. Because in the end, this story wasn't about outrage. It wasn't about winning a debate. It was about a man accused of hating Jesus, who loved him so deeply. The world had no choice but to listen.